Italy is the only country, along with Greece, that is poorer now than before having the euro as their official currency. The figures leave no space for doubt. Italians now have less purchasing power than before they joined the euro, which makes them one of the few countries that became worse off after joining the European Union. We are talking about the second biggest industrial power in all of Europe, which is only surpassed by Germany. In fact, during the 90s, the Italians were wealthier than the British and the French. Now, if you're my age or older, you might remember Eros Ramazzotti, Luciano Pavarotti, or the so-called Spaguetti Westerns. Yes, dear viewer, Italy was one of the biggest powerhouses on the planet, and all despite their government and their ruling class. The political history of Italy is... how should we say it? Well, let's just say it makes Game of Thrones look like the Gilmore Girls. Just remember, Italians have the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Calabrese 'Ndrangheta, the Neapolitan Camorra, and many, many other gangs. And yes, all of them have important connections with the highest levels of politicians. But there's more than just the mafia here. During the Cold War, some government officials helped extreme right-wing terrorist groups that organized the most violent attacks that you could imagine. And that's not even talking about the extreme left wing, which didn't exactly stay quiet either. The Red Brigades kidnapped and murdered an Italian prime minister. Look, if you're into scary stories, you should Google something about the propaganda duo, or you can just watch the movie Il Divo from Paolo Sorrentino. You will discover a fascinating country where politics are anything but boring. And now you might be wondering, well, what exactly is going on in Italy today? Do they have as much instability as they did in the 1970s and the 1980s? And the answer? Well, absolutely. In just 10 years, Italy has had 6 different prime ministers. 10 years! In other words, keeping up with Italian politics is a pretty impossible mission. And this is why, in this video, we're not actually going to talk about the Italian elections that have been celebrated recently, not even about Berlusconi's love life. Oh no, because the real question here is, how is it possible that such a chaotic country could manage to become quite so wealthy? And what is happening now after 2 decades of economic stagnation? Today, we're going to answer both of those questions. But before we do, let's take a look back at the good, the bad, and the ugly of Italian history.
Giulio Andreotti is the good.
During the 1940s, the Italian Communist Party was the biggest of its kind all across Western Europe. With more than 1.3 million members, they could win an election anytime they wanted. As you can imagine, in the middle of the Cold War, this was something America could not let happen. So, you remember that thing called the Marshall Plan? Well, if you've been following VisualPolitik for a long time, you already know that Uncle Sam sent lots and lots of money to Europe so they could rebuild their destroyed cities. When it came to Italy, this money was not only meant to help the country, but also to finance the only political party who could face that communist threat. This party was called Christian Democracy.
Mother, save your children from Bolshevism. Vote Christian Democracy.
In the next 50 years, Italy had 30 different prime ministers. This means that the average span of an Italian government was a little more than a year and a half, but they all had something in common. Most of them, they were Christian Democrat governments. And within the Christian Democrats is a man that you should know. His name was Giulio Andreotti, and he became Prime Minister 7 different times and is the real godfather of Christian democracy. For years, no Italian politician could do anything without being blessed by Mr. Andreotti.
Power wears out those who don't have it. Giulio Andreotti.
So, well, now the obvious question is, well, what did the Christian Democrats stand for? Well, Christian democracy was basically what we call a catch-up-all party. Anyone except communists could find his or her place inside of this party. And this included deals with Neapolitan Camorra, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, and allegedly extreme right-wing groups that terrorized the country during the 1980s. But we're going to talk about all of that in a future video. The important thing here is that Andreotti and his Christian Democrats badly needed popular support.
And you know, you need to win some elections.
In
In order to do that, what's better than employing people with a good salary? You see, Italy has over 3.5 million civil servants, and they're among the highest paid in the entire world. This means crazy public spending and lots of bureaucracy.
In fact, since Andreotti's time until now, Italy is famous for two things: red tape and ineffective courts. For a better understanding, let's imagine we have a company that produces construction machines and we have a client who doesn't pay us. Naturally, we would probably want to take him to court. If we are in, say, France, this process could take around 2.5 months, but in Italy, you could wait more than 3 years before the problem gets solved. As you might imagine, this is not exactly the best of business climates, but nevertheless, I did say that Italy became one of the wealthiest countries in all of Europe. So, how is that possible? Well, dear viewer, the answer lies in the Italian lira. Yes, you heard that right. When they had their own currency, the Italian central bank could devaluate their currency anytime they needed to put their economy on steroids. Well, now you might be wondering, well, but Simon, isn't this the worst thing that you could do? For instance, in another video, I told you that Germany became rich partly because they had a very stable currency, the Deutschmark. And now it seems that I'm telling you the exact opposite. I mean, how is it possible that Italy could grow so much, having so much corruption, so much red tape, and just constant devaluations? Well, let's dive in.
Rocco Siffredi is the ugly.
Having acted in more than 1,700 movies, Rocco Siffredi, aka the Italian Stallion, dominated the adult section of rental stores worldwide during the 1980s. And yet he is also an interesting symbol of the Italian economy at that time, a growth model that relied heavily on inflation. You see, during the 80s and the 90s, Italy flooded the world with cheap products. They were a kind of 20th century China. As soon as something worked in some other country, some Italian company would show up and make the same thing, but do it cheaper. Let's have a look at an example: American movies. In America, John Wayne movies were incredibly successful.
Let's go home, Debbie.
So Italian movie producers started doing more of the same, but at the industrial level. And this is how the Spaguetti Western was born. At the same time, the exact same thing was happening with other industries. While Donna Summer was making the entire world dance, Italians struck back with Sabrina, who did the same, but cheaper and more explicitly. But what about animated movies? While Disney was launching Aladdin in movie theaters, the cheap Italian version was already available in all of the country's video stores. But in Italy, they were cheaply reproducing more than just culture. In general, Italian companies mastered the art of making cheap things, or as economists would say, low added value manufacturing. Italy produced clothes, furniture, and plenty of plastic items. If you bought an animated action figure in the 1990s, it probably had a Made in Italy label somewhere. But if you bought a stereo sound system, it would have a Made in Germany or Made in Japan label. And now the question arises, well, why was the Italian economy so strongly based on selling cheap things abroad?
Well, look at this chart. Here you can see the value of the Italian lira against the German mark. As you can see, during the 80s and 90s, Italian currency was losing value all the time. In 1980, you could get 450 liras for 1 German mark. 15 years later, you could get 1,000 liras for 1 German mark. So what does this mean? It means innovation was way more expensive for Italian companies than for German ones.
For instance, imagine we have an Italian production company during the 1980s and we want to make a really innovative movie. Something like Star Wars with state-of-the-art special effects and cutting-edge technology. If we want to do that, we need to buy animation software that's produced in Japan and special cameras from America. But since our Italian currency is losing value all the time, those things are more expensive for us. And add to this that anytime we need to hire someone new, we're having to cut through never-ending red tape. So suddenly, not sounding so good, is it? But now imagine that instead of making a Star Wars-like film, we call our friend Rocco Siffredi and we make an adult movie with him. We just need a couple of cameras, a room, and a bed. And since we have a weak currency, we can sell our movies abroad for a lower price than any other film. So simply following this model, the Italian economy, it grew sky high. During these years, thousands of small companies were born. But make no mistake here, Italian SMEs had nothing to do with German SMEs. You see, German Mittelstands had between 50 and 200 workers, and they had enough scale to invest money on research and innovation. Italian companies were way smaller, their methods were more traditional, and their industries were, well, more illegal.
When Italy started taking account of its shadow economy, it found that it made up a fifth of Italian GDP. As a result, the economy grew by 18% overnight.
So now you might wonder, why should Italians innovate so much if they were doing so well by not doing it? Well, now I'm going to tell you why.
Silvio Berlusconi is the ugly.
Now, finally, the 21st century. Christian democracy, not really that important anymore. Now, the brand new leader of the center-right wing is the man you see on screen now, and yes, you might know that his name is Silvio Berlusconi.
I have little hair because my brain is so big it pushes everything else out. Silvio Berlusconi.
2002 was not the best year to the Italian Prime Minister. You know why? Well, because 2002 was the year Italy abandoned the Italian lira and started using the euro. And what's the main characteristic of the euro? Well, no government can decide by itself when they devalue it. Euros are issued by the European Central Bank, which includes representatives of all the member countries. This was a big problem for a country like Italy, which had become so addicted to devaluation. But things don't stop there. Maybe you remember another thing that happened at the beginning of the 2000s. And if you don't, well, let me refresh your memory.
China joins the World Trade Organization at last.
And so now you might be wondering, well, what does China have to do with the Italian economy? Well, as you might guess, rather a lot. The fact that China had joined the World Trade Organization was a symptom of something much bigger. It meant all of Asia was flooding the international markets. And it was not only China. Other countries like Thailand and Bangladesh were already becoming big manufacturing powerhouses. And surprise, surprise, what did these countries start manufacturing first? Well, very, very cheap things. Same as the Italians, but even cheaper. Back then, Germany was already a behemoth technology-wise, so despite the Asian competition, their products, they were still competitive. Meanwhile, Italy could not go back to old-school devaluation. First, they were now part of the euro, and second, devaluing wasn't a solution against Asia's cheap salaries.
Here's an example. One of the most symbolic Italian companies is Fiat. In 1990, they sold over 1.3 million cars in Europe. Now they only sell 700,000, and they can't get into new markets. Other brands like BMW still maintain their share on their traditional markets, and also they're growing in emerging countries like China.
But just hold on a minute here, because we're not done yet. You remember how Italy had over 3 million civil servants? Well, they are still there, and they still have to be paid. In other words, while the Italian economy is falling and their government is collecting fewer and fewer taxes, they are still spending the same amount of money. So, well, what does that mean? Well, it means Italy is now the fourth most indebted country on the planet. Their public debt is over 130% of their GDP, and this, dear viewer, is simply crazy.
Italy is Europe's next big problem.
So now the question is, should Italy abandon the euro so that they can go back to their devaluation methods and cheap manufacturing? Or maybe they should follow the German model and let their companies innovate more. Well, I've said my piece, so I'll just leave it to you to leave your comments in the section below. And if you are wondering now about how the German economic model works, maybe you missed our previous video, just click on this one you can see on the screen now and you'll learn everything you need to know about Germany's economy. There you go. And also, don't forget to visit the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that are not mine. And as always, don't forget we publish new videos every Monday and every Thursday, so hit that subscribe button and you will not miss a single post. If you like this video, also give it a thumbs up. And as always, see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.